Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to especially thank Ryan and Rachel Roos, the owners of this fine establishment, for once again giving us an opportunity to celebrate the release of a new book from Greg Kofford Books. I don't have a copy of it here. I kind of want to hold it up, but you all know it's Beholding the Tree of Life by Brad Kramer. Really, really important disambiguation here is that I am also Brad Kramer, and we are not, as you can plainly see, the same Brad Kramers. But hopefully that won't be too confusing. I also want to note that just a gentle reminder that there's fine art on the walls, very expensive fine art on the walls. Not that I'm expecting any of you to buy it, but just be careful around it.
Or you may buy it.
Your job is to police this paint, keep people away from this one. But again, I want to thank Zion's Books, and I want to thank Ryan and Rachel. And now I would like to introduce our panelists. So we're going to hear from the three panelists, just kind of brief responses to the book, give Brad a chance to kind of give his own response to what they have to say, and then hopefully we'll have a chance to do some audience Q&A as well. I'm just going to go straight through. I think the order we're actually going to go in is, I'll introduce people first, we'll talk about the order. So we have Delise Snyder. Delise is in the English faculty at BYU, and you're also involved in a campus writing program. You run the program?
Writing across the curriculum. I run the writing across the curriculum and advanced writing in the English department.
There you go. So, and then she's also published work on the writing of Cormac McCarthy, as well as some work on Christian iconography.
Yeah, on Brian Krushitz's art.
There you go. So we're very delighted to have her and her perspective here. Brad Kramer is the author of the book. And master's degree in English from UNC Chapel Hill, where you studied with Richard Gilbert
That's
Russ.
correct. He was my thesis advisor for my master's.
He got out. He managed to escape the horrors of the academy and get a proper job, and at the same time slowly write a very good book that he's been working for the better part of a couple decades on. So we're very lucky to have it. Richard Gilbert Russ, as I mentioned, is now emeritus professor of English at UNC Chapel Hill. Also currently serving as a missionary on Temple Square. Did I get that right? Is that correct?
That's close enough. I'm in the church history library.
Oh, there you go, the church history library. I apologize.
No, that's fine.
And author of Feasting on the Word. It's called The Literary Testimony of the Book of Mormon, is it? There you go.
Thank you.
And has had I think a notable impact on Brad and on his writing. Last but not least, we have Jack Welch, who needs no introduction, whose contributions to Mormon studies and to critical thinking about the Book of Mormon are way too much for me to list. He did bring copies of one of a recent book that he recently wrote called The Legal Cases in the Book of Mormon, which has some scholarship that's also relevant to the conversation we're going to be having today. In fact, I imagine we'll hear something from Jack about some of his own research and how it relates to Brad's book. But very grateful to all the panelists, Delise, Elder Rust, Jack, thank you for coming. I think we're going to hear from Elder Rust first, and then Delise. Jack will wrap us up, and then Brad will get a chance to kind of give a rejoinder and then get your questions ready if you have them.
Thank you very much. It's easy to remember your name. I want to be first because, in this case, I think the first one, because Brad and I have had a long association, but an association associated with what he's been doing on this book and has done. It's a great accomplishment, and I congratulate him on it. Brad, I was involved with Brad in rabbinic reading before I ever knew what it meant. Long before that, and we would enjoy one-on-one visits about the Book of Mormon. Particularly engaged in our reading Isaiah in detail. And I've thoroughly enjoyed that, and I've understood the spirit of that, though, more by reading his book. I had the opportunity to read it through and reflect on it. And there's another reason I wanted to start, because I want to talk about the impact of the book. I mentioned to a colleague, Jay Perry, and some of you may know Jay or may know his brother Don. Jay is a historian and a writer in the church history library. Anyway, I told him that I was interested in rabbinic reading, and he said, "What is rabbinic reading?" I said, I'm glad you asked that, because I'd like to try it out here in the library with you and then with another missionary colleague. And so I wanted him to understand this, and I started with Brad's concepts that came out of his book in terms of rabbinic reading. I explained to them the Rabbiic Approach. I read a number of things from what Brad had written about the Rabbiic Approach, and also referred to some other works. And I'm sure that there's at least a shade of James Faulkner here, because some of you may know he talked about reading with the Jewish professor Stephen Goldman, and that's quite a story in terms of his reading. He said, "Well, what would you like to do?" "Well, I like to do the Book of Genesis." Well, Rabbi Goldman said, "We can't just do the Book of Genesis." They were going to be working on this a little bit, and if they get through the first chapter, I think they got into the second in terms of long-term reading. But that type of thing is what James Faulkner has done with these making hard books. It's certainly the kind of thing that's been done with now seven groups of gatherings sponsored by the Lars Willis Center in terms of their Mormon theology seminars. Some of you may know that, where they study works in detail. But there are two parts to the Rabbinic Approach, and you can read it as you read the book if you haven't read it already. But it's reading scriptures closely. I mean, that's the start. You read, and that's a major part. But it's and it's Shavratot, and you'll have to pronounce that right for me.
Chavruta.
Okay, you just heard it from him, and that's what it was. In other words, it's a partnership, and that's what Brad and I were engaged in many years ago, was this partnership, and it was a wonderful experience. And now, Brad quotes Rabbi Morris Kircher as saying, "We Jews spend a long time on a page. We do not read rapidly through a biblical text, so much as we read a single verse or two, and let our eyes meander through various commentaries on the page, playing with the various ways Jews in times past have read a passage before us. In this way, any given page of the book in our hands is like a guided tour through the inner landscape of the collective Jewish soul, all the way from the ancient Aramaic alternative version of the biblical text itself to the medieval mystics and rationalists who stop off points in classical rabbinic sources along the way." Brad continues to say that the point is that two people get more out of a sacred text when they read it together than they would if they simply read it by themselves, even with the supervision of a trained teacher. He quotes Rabbi Norman Cohen as saying, "Each one of us also needs someone with whom to study continually, from whom we can learn in a variety of ways." Now, as I said, I'd really tested this out, and I've had it. It's ongoing now. Started around the 1st of September. We chose the first two verses of 1 Nephi, and we spent a full hour and felt like we had not exhausted the first two verses. We meet every other week now, but we went on to verses 3 and 4, and that was another hour's work. We then took a couple of verses out of Isaiah and spent a lot of time with that, and I thoroughly enjoyed that experience as well. And it's this close reading, but understanding and back and forth that goes on in this kind of reading, that it really bonds people together. And this is again from Brad's book. He quotes Rabbi Meyer, who suggests that the Torah that we drink can be supplied only by a person with whom we are close, a soulmate, if you will, who can serve as a perpetual source of nourishment. Brad goes on to say such a feast is simply not possible alone or in a large group. Again, it is much like a marriage, the foremost image of the relationship God has with his people. As Rabbi Emil Fackenheim writes, just as it is not good for a man to be alone, so it is not good for a student to study Torah alone. Well, this has been my experience, and again, has been special with Brad. We read Herman Melville together. Now that's an exciting experience to read Melville together. And we moved past the year. We moved through Moby Dick and settled a good while with Pierre. Now that's really a challenging work, but we had a great experience with that, and Brad wrote a remarkably fine master's thesis on Melville's Pierre. Now I was introduced. I've been a student and teacher of great English and American literature. I have long practiced close reading of texts, including the scriptures. But I've come to realize that reading with a friend in Shavruta, you can pronounce that one.
Shavruta.
Okay, and you heard our friends, enhances and deepens my understanding. James Faulkner expressed what has been my experience when he said, I learn better when I think about things with other people. And this type of experience, he said, provides an exciting and eye-opening fresh engagement with our sacred scriptures. And similarly, Adam S. Miller said, theology can't proceed on its own. It can't start from itself. It builds as a layering of voices. It begins by reading Scripture with an unparalleled attention to structures and details, and then it responds to their call with an antiphonal echo. But more, it doesn't read Scripture alone. Its weakness prompts it to read collectively, collaboratively, and test its own response against the responses of bodies with different voices and different ears. So anyway, this has been an ongoing experience now, as I've told you, a rabbinic reading of the Scriptures, which I thoroughly enjoy. And should anybody want to visit with me about Isaiah 2, I'd be happy to do it, but not right now.
I'm Delise Snyder, and I've known Brad longer than you have, because we were freshmen together at UA in our very first class.
Don't bring that up.
So it was a long time ago. But I think we're both a lot smarter than we were back there in 1970s.
I think anybody would be.
I feel like in reading this book that I just read the Old Testament and the Book of Mormon all within about a week, because you go through the sweep of a good portion of the Old Testament and really all of the Book of Mormon. And this morning, my husband and I begin each day reading a chapter of the Book of Mormon. And it so happened today we read the last chapter of Moroni. So it was really a beautiful way to start this day and wrap up that sacred book, and then and talk about this book. To me, one of the things that this book does is connect Scripture. In the past, whenever I hit Jacob, is it 5? It's the allegory of the olive tree. I'd gird up my loins and push through. It's like, okay, here comes olive tree again. And then, of course, the Isaiah sections of the Book of Mormon are hard for people, and they're stumbling blocks for many people. But this book links up the Old Testament and has the Book of Mormon as almost a response or continuation of the Old Testament. And so it makes what look like completely different scripture all one whole, with some of the New Testament there too. So we don't get that integration a lot. In Sunday school, we study one, then the other, then the other, then the other. But here you get that integration as one big a story, a chiasmic story of from creation to judges and kings, and then going back through with kings and judges, and ending at kind of creation again. So for me, that was I feel like now that when I hit Jacob 5, I have context now for the olive tree. I mean, I could tell you what it meant. I know, this is an allegory. I know what it means. It's this and that. But I didn't really connect to that allegory much in the past. And the fact that we have whole chapters of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon is sometimes, it's kind of odd that we have entire chapters kind of dropped in there. And this has more explanation for how that is tying into the tradition of the Old Testament. It's not just dropped in there like I thought. We're told to behold the Book of Mormon, and the beholding is I felt like I have beheld centuries in this past week as I've looked at details that I haven't really noticed before. For example, my little handwritten notes here. I'm not even going to try any of the Hebrew words, but pairing of Moses and Jesus, or how about how Mormon and Moroni are also like Adam? I have never made that pairing before. How the judges in the Book of Mormon are like the judges in the Old Testament. How the kings in the Book of Mormon are like the kings in the Old Testament. How Jared is like Noah. So there are a lot of connections that I have never made before, which makes me read the scripture differently, which is, of course, the point, in a much richer reading. Now, I have some questions, because I'm an English person. Don't write this down, it's all right. I know how to do literary interpretations. It's kind of one of the things I do for a living, and I love to do literary interpretations, but sometimes those can take you in directions that maybe are not going to bring you to God. For example, I have a friend who teaches as a friend of my daughter's, who teaches at Johns Hopkins in English, and he assigned the Book of Mormon to his students, at least the first part of it. And I was curious to know what their reaction was. Well, guess what they thought the worst character in the very beginning was? Nephi. Who would want this self-righteous brother coming at these, the Laman and Lemuel, they're just kind of living their lives, and so I thought, wow, I've never thought of Nephi that way before, and you gave us some insight into that too, how Nephi was, he can be a little self-righteous, and he is writing it himself, but then he also learns, and it takes him in good places. And that's really helpful. Now, the idea that you read with a partner, I think, is a grand idea. But one of my critiques of the rabbinical tradition, and pretty much, I guess you could extend it to some of the Old Testament and most of the Book of Mormon, is that there aren't any women around, and so there are a few. I think I counted 10 mentioned in your book. We've got once in there, but the Book of Mormon doesn't mention women a lot, certainly not by name very often, and so I would hope that if we take this rabbinical tradition of reading with a partner, how about a husband-wife is a good partnership, where you have different viewpoints coming through. It's very binding, and it's a good way of looking at things. As a teenager, I loved Proverbs 31, where it talks about who can find a virtuous woman. But then, as I was a young wife, I started reading it again and saying, now wait a second, she's doing this, and she's finding, she's weaving, she's feeding her family, she's selling land, she's doing all this, so her husband can sit at the gate. And I thought, that's not my favorite scripture anymore. And so I think the way to avoid the pride that might come from the heavily intellectual experience of delving deep is to do some of the things that the woman in Proverbs 31 does, but also sit at the gate and have equal time at the gate equal time dyeing the cloth and feeding the family. And so I'm hoping that the rabbinical tradition, which has not included women as far as I know, in this particular way, could be extended to say the woman's voice is just as important, not an appendage or a blank, unnamed person. But that to me, that's some way that we can expand reading that way too. As I started reading this, I pulled up a talk that people are referring to by David Bednar about a reservoir of living water that he gave a few years ago. It talked about how we should read Scripture, and this talk has informed how BYU does its religious education classes now that are going to change in this next year, and those are going to extend to all the Institute programs. And he says you should, of course, read Scripture from the beginning to end. Another way is to study by topic, and another way is to connect, find patterns, find connections. And that being a great way to learn. And this book finds patterns and connections that I wouldn't have thought of before. It's really enlightening to see that, and to really have a way to approach the Book of Mormon that ties it greatly to the Old Testament.
Well, very wheel there.
Yeah. I'm very happy to be able to be here with you tonight and to say some things very positive about this book, which I am very happy to have read. When the other Brad, you called and asked if I would be a part of this, I was immediately attracted to the subject and said, that's a book I need to read and want to read. I've spent a lot of time dealing with people, mostly from a legal perspective, from a Jewish point of view. I've been a member of the Jewish Law Association, one of the few Gentiles who participates in that international body, and I joined that group over 30 years ago. So I've sat in lots of meetings, lunches, conferences, listening to Jews read their text. And there's nothing like a good Jewish reading and conversation about things. Now, Brad, I really like how you talk about multiple interpretations and how people are friendly. But you haven't sat and listened to some Jewish lawyers going after each other. What this text means, and the rabbinical tradition is more a pastoral one, where if you're dealing with the Bet Din and you've got to decide cases and you have to get into your Jewish texts in minute detail to figure out what rulings a reading will support or not, you can get some really, really, what should we say, belligerent kind of readings, but all within the context of deep respect for the text and wanting to get out of it absolutely as much as you can. And Brad, I really like what you've done with the importance of detailed readings, individual words. Every word counts. And, it's true, if you have two rabbis, you've got three opinions, or maybe more. But all of those various opinions are a product of the fact that words themselves are often ambiguous, and probably intentionally so. Especially with Hebrew, where you have a fewer number of basic roots. Hebrew is not nearly as technical a language as Greek, and so you can get lots of interesting play on words and different root combinations coming out, and that's why sitting and reading with lots of different people is so rewarding and interesting. It helps to read with people who have training in different areas. Reading with women gives you a new perspective on things. Reading with a sociologist is going to see things in the text dealing with human behavior that you and I probably wouldn't see. Hugh Nibley was kind of this way of taking a text and just reading it from lots of different angles, and talk about one semester he took Moses, who was supposed to do the whole Pearl of Great Price, and they ended up not even getting out of Moses chapter 1 for the whole semester. And, but it's that kind of really rich reading that rewards over and over again the kind of reading that Brad has given us. So I was thrilled to read this book. I think what he has done gives us some frameworks so that you don't feel like a rabbinical approach is just some mystical or unknowable kind of thing, but he really made it familiar. And when you talk about reading as with a friend, I felt like you were my friend as you guided me through that process. Very, very gentle and informative and helpful explanation. I connected with a lot of things personally where I thought, yeah, you're really onto something there, and well, there's a lot more. In my own research, I go drilling in a lot of places, and sometimes you go down an alley and there's nothing down there. Sometimes I think of it like drilling for oil. And you drill, and if you hit something, you know that there's probably more right in that area. And you keep drilling and hopefully find more and more to pull out. And I think lots of what you say will reward even further drilling, and that's the way this whole process works. So, but I resonated with a lot of things. Your comments about how to understand the slaying of Laban, and this comes back to Nephi and his problems there. And now I tend to approach this more from a legal perspective. And one text that you did put in was the words that are given to Nephi by the Spirit twice: slay him, for the Lord hath delivered him into thy hands. You got a lot of other things, especially Nephi going through this kind of mock trial of Laban. I think I disagree that anything that Laban had done deserved the death penalty. But Nephi does have to wrestle like an interpreter of the text to find out, what should I do under this circumstance? And I like what you said about him being probably needing to do this for self-defense. Because there's a lot of scenarios that you can play out here. But one possibility is that Laban was dressed, after all, in military attire because he was meeting with his company, as he's commanding 50 people, and he knows that the 4 sons of Lehi are not far outside of the city. And Lehi, after all, is a wanted criminal. They would like to execute him if they can get him. And so it may well be that they were about to come out on patrol and find him and maybe kill him. Kill Nephi and his brothers. But anyway, there's a lot of who knows what's going on there. But what we do know is that the words, slay him, for the Lord hath delivered him into thy hands, comes straight out of Exodus chapter 21. And that's a part of the definition of an excusable homicide. So a legal perspective can join in this conversation to help, especially with the first, and I think most fundamental part of rabbinic reading, which is trying to understand the original text or what it meant. I think, my book on the legal cases in the Book of Mormon uses a lot of Talmudic and Jewish text, even though they hadn't been written at the time that Nephi and Lehi would have left Jerusalem. But most of those rabbinic texts, most of the later Jewish tradition is grounded in the Torah. It's grounded in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so even something like, better that one man should perish than a whole nation should dwindle in unbelief, is a principle that the rabbis recognized much later, but they grounded in stories from Samuel. And there's even a tradition coming right out of the time of Zedekiah, and Jehoiakim, and so on. But in any event, let me just say that this close looking at each of the words, I work on chiasmus in the Book of Mormon, is another way of reading it. But once again, I proceed in this analysis with the assumption that every word that's there in the Book of Mormon is there for a reason, that it's important. And maybe it's up to me or all of us to try to figure out why might those words be there the way they are. And I think you've opened up a lot of wonderful things for us to think about. Let me say that oh wow, lots of notes here, and I think my time is up. So let me conclude by saying I had a week's experience once when I went over to Canterbury. I was able to sit and read the Book of Mormon for a whole week with the president of the Jewish Law Association. And as I read what you were talking about, reading together and reading with friends, I kept reflecting on things that we talked about, what he saw in the text that I hadn't seen, and how I could share things with him. Your comment that true friends, when they read, are like God, always optimistic, full of faith and confidence in their partner and in the Torah. And I think that epitomizes my experience with reading the Book of Mormon from a rabbinic or Jewish perspective. And I can only hope that it will catch on and that people will appreciate the way in which we can learn from other people who have read their scriptures so seriously. Now, my next question is, who's going to write a book about reading the Book of Mormon from a Buddhist approach? Or from... but all of these religious traditions, especially those that are grounded deeply in sacred scripture, can be partners with us culturally in helping us to read our texts. As Jonathan Z. Smith, as retiring president of the Society of Biblical Literature a few years ago, said that anyone who knows only one canon of Scripture knows no canon of Scripture, kind of adopting some other ways in which that thought has been used. But he they're speaking to the whole Society of Biblical Literature, said, you ought to know another Scripture. Well, why not the Book of Mormon or the Pearl of Great Price or a lot of others as well? And I think, a day for the Book of Mormon is now. And it can be read in so many ways and can help people, it can help women, it can help fathers, it can help bishops, it can help patriarchs. There's hardly a station in life where a reading of the Book of Mormon won't enrich and make our lives better. That's been my experience. And so I just want to congratulate you on a wonderful book. I'm very pleased. What's not to like about this book? Thanks, Brad.
Thank you. Am I supposed to answer that question? Counterpoint, no. Thank you very much, panelists. I want to especially thank the people who have shown up today. The fact that you all would be interested in a topic that has basically captivated me for 2 decades means a tremendous amount to me. It's very important to me that you would have that kind of interest to show up and to read the book and to praise the book. It's tremendously meaningful to me. Again, thanks for the panelists for their gracious praise for taking the time to read this, probably on a short notice. I'm very appreciative of that. And I'm quite indebted to these panelists and other people. Certainly to Jack. In the Book of Mormon, the idea of chiasmus, which you actually invented, right? No, I'm sorry. Discovered and popularized. Becomes really a structuring element in the Book of Mormon, as Delise was saying, in connection with the Hebrew Scriptures. Very important and is built upon the giants that have gone before, not only Jack, but many people in farms. I'm deeply indebted to your personal work as well as the work that you fostered. the idea of the drill, I think, certainly resonates with what I was doing. I wasn't basically trying to show that there's oil here, in a sense, and giving you the tools to drill, the kind of drill, maybe the drill bit, and suggesting some of the things that you would find as you would drill down. This is certainly not exhaustive of the approaches, let alone the results that you would find in reading the Book of Mormon. So your perspective is certainly consistent with some of the things that I was trying to bring about. And I thoroughly hope that this book is a beginning of a conversation, a beginning of a way of study, and by no means is the last word. And so if other people with other expertise and greater expertise than me eclipse my work, no one would be more pleased, really. I'm very thankful for Delise. As she said, we've known each other for quite a while. I'm grateful for her friendship. I'm grateful she and her husband Phil read an early draft and gave me some very helpful comments. I'm also very grateful for the institutions and the programs that she represents. My time at BYU in the English department and the honors program and in various writing programs was absolutely fundamental and transformative to me as a person, as a thinker, as a writer, and many of the things that I do in these areas are just dependent and really come from these things that she brought up. I have to say that if you get the idea that I have now represented the whole rabbinic thought, that's not with my purpose. This is mostly just kind of samples and examples, important principles that I think are in common of rabbinic thought, but it's tremendously more complex and more wide-ranging than what I portray in the book. I'm just trying to give you some tools, an idea of how people approach this sort of thing, and it's not meant as an exhaustive treatment of rabbinic thought then or now. And the idea that women should be involved, well, historically the rabbinical students were men for quite some time, but that certainly has changed a great deal among modern Judaism. The women rabbis that worked in some of the synagogues that I would certainly agree. And I think the idea that came across in this book of this relationship of studying with someone, and this brings you closer, you learn more. Even the idea in Judaism where two are studying the Torah together, the Shekhinah, which in their terms is the indwelling presence of God, dwells with them, is certainly consistent with this. This is an idea, and the idea of a husband and wife studying the Book of Mormon deeply together, I think would eventually bring them close together. But there is the idea that Jack brought about, that when you work together as a partner, you have a duty to the other partner. They talk about it sharpening the other person. You're asking the deep questions. You're challenging them a little bit. Maybe you're being a little bit rough and tumble in some ways, but you're doing it with the faith that the two of you can find answers and find more depth in this. And that's fundamental to this. And if a husband and wife can get through that, I'm sure they'd be much better together. But they would certainly agree that women should be included and are very valuable in this. And if I didn't present that quite very well, that's my mistake in not covering the whole tradition there. Dick talked about our relationship, which I'm very grateful for as a person. And much of the work, actually all the work that I have ever done and thought about in the Book of Mormon is really dependent on the foundation that he has given me. Dick and I, my wife and I moved to Chapel Hill. I was a graduate student in English, and we were in a very small branch at the time, maybe 50 people in sacrament meetings, something like that. So Dick was my gospel doctrine teacher, as well as my teacher of American novel, 19th century American novel. And initially we didn't really connect, I don't think. But I got in trouble as a student. I had this idea for a thesis. I had an idea for an advisor, both of which completely collapsed. And I needed to finish this so that I could then teach and then get money for this new child that was on our way. Dick rescued me basically by suggesting a series of thoughts that I could start thinking about and come up with a more viable topic. And then proceeded to work out a plan where we could then work this out and do it in a constructive manner and get on to other things. And it was probably one of the most educative experiences I ever had in graduate school as far as what it is to be a scholar, what it is to be a writer, how to present these things in an important way. and the experience that we had with Melville. There's a few authors where you can delve as deeply as Melville, and that was certainly important. We worked together. We met once a week, and we would go through these things, and he would suggest a number of ideas. And as we progressed in this work, he would start telling me about a work that he was working on. The work that led up to his really very monumental book, Feasting on the Word. And as my thesis wound down, we would talk about this more and more. It was very important. And then after I finished the thesis, we just kept continuing. We kept every week would meet together and discuss the Book of Mormon and his work with that. And again, this was transformative to me. I had studied literature. I had learned some of the tools of literary analysis and discussion and appreciation, but it had never occurred to me to train all these tools on the Book of Mormon until he brought this to my attention. And it was absolutely fascinating. We'd discuss some topic, and I'd basically think about it all week. And I'd come to his office, and I would be full of all these new ideas that no one had ever thought of before. And I'd present this to Dick, and he would smile, and he would reach over to his filing cabinet and pull out an inch-thick file and say, "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too." He says that I hope in his book, I don't know that I did much about other than being a very appreciative audience, but when I think about the education that I got several months, even years of these weekly tutorials from the foremost expert in the literature of the Book of Mormon. That is a very rare, perhaps unique education in the Book of Mormon, to which I am very, very grateful for in that way. I'm also grateful, and we haven't really mentioned this, to the Durham Reformed Judea congregation. This is a Reformed congregation in Durham, near Duke. And as I was building upon some of the things that I and Dick had learned about the literary aspect of the Book of Mormon, connecting it with a Jewish approach, which is very, or a rabbinic approach, which is very literary, I became very concerned, even plagued by the idea that I was getting it wrong. I had read a number of books about Mormons by people who aren't Mormon, who are honest and study, and do their hard, but they just get things a little wrong. Some of the terms are not terms that Mormons would use. Some of the perspectives of maybe the way the church is run seem to mirror a little bit more of their perspective rather than the Mormon perspective. And I thought, I've read these books, I've studied it, I've gone to some lectures, but how do I really know that Jews work in this way? How do they approach Scripture? So I enrolled in an introduction to Judaism class at the synagogue, and they brought in rabbis from the whole area, not just Reform rabbis, but Reconstructionist rabbis, conservative rabbis. I think there was a humanist rabbi, and various other rabbis who worked for Duke but were not congregational pulpit rabbis. And I learned a little bit more about the diversity of this thing and gave a little bit more of a feel. And afterwards I approached Rabbi Friedman, who was the rabbi of Judea Reform, and asked if there was some more education that I could get. And he said, well, we have these monthly Torah and Talmud classes at our synagogue. You're certainly welcome to that. Open invitation. I'm not a member of the congregation. They just welcomed me to this. And it was a little bit awkward going to the class because what do you say? Hello, I'm the Mormon here. I didn't know how. Rabbi Friedman knew exactly what I was doing. It was hard to introduce myself to other people. But and Kramer can be a Jewish name, so they automatically kind of assumed I just moved into the area. And I watched what they were doing, and I was a little bit concerned. How do I fit in with this group? And I felt kind of like a spy. Somehow I'm writing that this is what you really are, or something. And that felt dishonest. And so I would venture a few opinions or things on what we were talking about. Again, not as a Mormon, not even from a Mormon perspective, but just dealing with the text that we were going into. And we would have outside discussions, and it gradually became more and more obvious as we talked about that I was a Mormon. I explained some of the things that I was doing, and they were all very welcoming, very helpful. One fellow even said, could a Jew understand the Book of Mormon? I said, well, I'd really like it if you would try, because not many Jews I know read the Book of Mormon. I'd love to get your perspective. And he said, well, you're almost a Jew. and he kind of smiled, laughed, and we started to drive off, and my car was ahead of him. I stopped my car, I got out, I went back to him, and I said, I take that as a supreme compliment. I meant it that way. And so I have tried through this to be very respectful. When I initially went to this congregation, I told the rabbi I was very much aware of the reputation we all have of proselyting. And I said, I want you to know I'm coming there to learn. I want to know what you have to say and to apply it to my life. I'm not coming to proselyte or to convert. He laughed and said, okay, we have a deal. You don't convert me, and I won't convert you. And so we have worked out a very respectful relationship, and I have experienced some of these discussions where I mean, it was almost Talmudic, because this is a little bit hard on a Mormon soul, because we go through gospel doctrine classes, and in 35 minutes we have gone through all of Jeremiah, sometimes Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, all of that, okay, we're done with that. So this group, in an hour and a half, would go through maybe 5 lines of Leviticus. And you take this sort of thing, and they certainly would look at the Hebrew and what it would possibly mean, how it works with the translation, but how it connects to their lives, how it connects to their experiences, how it connects to the political situation, some stories that would come up. It's very wide-ranging, and really, I mean, certainly being analytical about it, but also very associative. How does this connect to this sort of thing? And it really occurred to me that that's really the spirit of the Talmud, and the spirit maybe of a rabbinic tradition, where the scripture is this catalyst where you can get almost unlimited meaning as you delve into it and wrestle with it, and you challenge the people with you. You ask them questions in a well-meaning sort of way and grow from that sort of thing. So I'm very grateful for that congregation, for having this experience. The purpose in this book, again, is to kind of open up other people's eyes the way Dick opened my eyes to the literary quality of the Book of Mormon, but also the way this congregation opened my eyes to the scriptures too. There's so many different meanings, and so we're trying always to learn from Judaism and what they had and apply it to our situation. He talked about this relationship. He talked about this chavruta, this partnership. And frankly, I think that Mormons and Jews are an ideal partnership. We have so many things in common, so much of a history, so many values, and such an interest in getting the most out of our scriptures that it'll be tough. There'll be some things that we have to work out. There'll be some challenging questions, but I think it's really an ideal situation. In fact, I brought a little visual aid. This, which the Judea Reform congregation loaned me, is a candle, a Havdalah candle that they will light at the end of Sabbath. They light this, and it commemorates the end of the Sabbath, and you can see that it's a number of candles basically woven together in kind of a braid, and then producing a light. And to me, this is my image of how it has been working with my friends, the Jews, and how this partnership, and my feelings about the church are so intertwined with what I've learned about Judaism, and then it sheds light in the end. So I just think that's a very fitting example of how this partnership can work with us, but also with this very varied and very challenging and very wonderful and very deep faith that Mormons can run for as well, with as well. So. Thank you very much. Master of Ceremonies is now going to ask for questions.
Yeah. Consider it done. Anybody have questions they want to ask any of the panelists? Or I guess maybe we could ask first, do any of you have anything to say in response to Richard's comments before... I'm sorry, to Brad's comments.
You've forgotten your name already.
There's a Richard up there. Okay?
I have questions.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay,
actually, questions are the heart. If you want to think of something about the rabbinic tradition, it really is asking questions with the optimism that you're going to have an answer. It's not asking a question like to make fun of people, but you have this confidence that we can figure this out.
Well,
so let's figure this out.
So the entwined in your candle. We're really open to learning about from the Judaic tradition, and you mentioned a little bit, but do you think that I think that the Book of Mormon can really enrich their tradition. Do you think they're open to that? Are they going to do the bending it takes
again, Again, I think there are just as many Jews in the world as there are Mormons, and so there are so many different opinions and so many different approaches and that sort of thing. I don't know exactly how to answer. I do know.
Well, do you find that? Do you find
because
curious?
my friends, I mentioned this book to them. I also, as part of this, belong to a Jewish history book club, which they invited me to. They've also invited me to the naming of their children. I've gone to high holidays, and it's been a wonderful sort of thing. But when out of my exuberance that this was being published, let them know, and they were very excited, wanted to read it. One of them even suggested they read it in our Jewish history book club, and I don't think this is Jewish or history.
Yeah, it is. It depends on how you define Jewish.
But again, I think it's how we approach this. If we approach this in a superior way, we have everything, and we're going to now tell you what you believe or what you should believe. That's certainly a non-starter and is very arrogant. And I've learned in my discussions with these Jews, they're very open about themselves and about their problems and about things that they don't understand. And if I'm similarly open and about it, they are very welcome to this conversation. We have one of the highlights of this exchange was that we put together actually a joint Mormon Jewish Torah study. Because of what I've been involved, our young men's president asked if we could do some sort of joint young men's thing. And I said, well, again, we know Brad, but we don't know you guys. Is there a way we could have a dinner or something together? And they kind of hesitated, and then the rabbi suggested that we have this joint session. And so we had, I think you participated in this, right? Yes. We had probably 20 Mormons and 20 Jews side by side in this discussion. And rather than hitting the usual topics of Jesus and Messianic prophecy, we actually chose Numbers 11, where it talks about, I would to God that all the Lord's people would be prophets. So we discussed prophets and the roles of prophecies and that sort of thing. It's an amazingly productive discussion. It didn't come out with a conclusion, but the discussion, the journey is really important. So in my experience, they're interested. They like to know what we believe, and are very, very curious. As long as we're not pushy and salesmanshipy about it, the whole thing. And they find a great commonality because if we got to know them a little bit better, there were various things that they were concerned about, especially with 9/11, about the way that some people in this country were basically coming down on Muslims and blaming Muslims, and they took it upon their cause to say, we should remember that these are real people and not persecuted. And one of the examples that they used of persecutions, religious persecutions, that we should avoid comes from Mormonism. So they were actually using the Missouri period as an example of a terrible thing that happened, and we should avoid that. And so there is this kind of sense of commonality. One of the reasons, in this book you'll find a number of Hebrew terms, and I didn't do this just to show off my ignorance or my knowledge. I think one of the things that happens they do discuss using Hebrew terms, and many of their concepts are expressed this way. And it's a little bit of a roadblock for this discussion if you don't understand them. So if I tried to introduce those and have a glossary there, so that if you know these sorts of terms, we can have a greater communication, because I think the concepts are very similar. Concepts of covenant people, of the idea of bettering this world instead of just simply waiting for the next world. I have never seen a group of people, including Mormons, that were so proud of their children, and that sort of thing. So that's another commonality we have, I think. So,
and you don't have to pronounce the words to read the book. So
that's right.
That word.
You have a nice glossary there at the back of the book. So.
That's right.
That's very helpful.
I probably should have done some sort of pronunciation. So
I don't know.
That would fail.
But also within Judaism, there's lots of different pronunciations. So in a sense, they don't. If you try, maybe they'll work with it.
We do have a question back here.
I have a question.
Yes,
so,
Mary. I'm glad to see longtime friends here today.
So some of us have not had the advantage of reading the book yet, and I'm really looking forward to it. But can I ask you, as the author, to give us one small example? I like the idea of connections and viewing it, with a rabbinic view. One small example of something that's particularly meaningful to you in the book, kind of as a teaser for us.
Of connections?
Yeah. Or anything.
You have hundreds of them?
I mean, there are.
One of the really difficulties to me of writing about the Book of Mormon is that the more I delve into it and try to write it, the more I discover something else and have to rewrite what I'm doing. Because it is so, if you look at it, it's much more intertwined than this. And so it's really hard for me to focus on one particular example. Did you have one? Give me some time so I can think about it.
Interconnection with plainness.
Okay.
Is a plain example.
Okay.
You might want to talk about...
Yeah, the Hebrew word is pashat, and that's basically what the plain meaning of it. And much of Jewish interpretation is, first of all, have a foundation of really looking at the words and understanding what they mean, and then you can go to other allegorical interpretations or mystical interpretations or sermonic. But there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on looking at the words closely, and even looking at words that are kind of weird. I mean, sometimes when I or other people will read it, we'll gloss over some of the words. Well, I don't know what that means, I'll just move along. They actually tend to look for these things that are a little bit strange. One thing that I've always wondered about is why the whole story of Hagoth in there. Because somebody who's curious and goes off on a ship and they're, how does this work in the story? Why was this brought up? It really is something that tantalizes. It's actually called, they call it a kotsim or a thorn, something that really snags your attention. And rather than avoiding it and putting it aside or shelving it somewhere, the idea is kind of focus on that sort of thing. And so you get a Nephi that's talking so much about plainness. Plainness in the scripture, he delights in plainness. It's not simply, I don't think, the easy interpretation. It's making sure you really understand exactly what's going on, because then he extrapolates from a lot of those concepts and comes up with the sermons, that sort of thing. So it's the foundation. So, again, I delight in plainness, the plain meaning. There's a lot of this thing that really, I think, connects in a resonantial way with a rabbinic approach. Did you think of something else?
Jesus and Moses.
Okay. Jesus and Moses.
Jesus and Moses. This is actually very interesting to me because, essentially, in 3rd Nephi, Jesus shows up and gives a Sermon on the Mount that's very close to the King James Version. There are some additions and that sort of thing along the way. And it looks like, why did you bother to repeat it? It's good for them. I'm glad to have, why is this in the Book of Mormon? This is just a repetition. I can just go to Matthew and that sort of thing. But there's so much in this concept, in this context, that places it in an entirely different view that really connects him with Moses. Because you have, certainly Matthew makes a big point of this. He's on the mount, just like Moses was on the Mount Sinai. There are kind of 5 parts to the book of Matthew that kind of go along with the five books of Moses. There's a number of things that happened to him beforehand, going to Egypt and coming out of it, connecting with Moses. But there's so much of that thing that really connects it with the Sinai experience. You have a people, when Jesus is born, that are just about ready to be annihilated, and they're saved, and essentially by the birth of a deliverer, the sign of a deliverer, which really connects, I think, in the sense of the Moses story. The wicked people are destroyed, much like the Egyptian army, and especially the idea of the whole Mosaic Sinai experience was there to make a kingdom of priests and a lamb there. And it doesn't quite work for a number of reasons. People didn't exactly want to go up on the mountain, but you have that actually realized in 4th Nephi, where you have a kingdom of priests, people who actually live what they call the law of holiness in the law of Leviticus. So it really just expands this from simply a Moses figure to kind of a super Moses, someone who is continuing those thoughts, that sort of thing. So, does that matter to you?
Thank you. Yes.
Read the book.
I
There's more to it. Again, it is so hard to write about the Book of Mormon because the more you get into it, the more it just expands.
Here's an example of where there's more you can drill. And you probably know some of this and wanted to keep the book manageable, so you didn't put all of this in. But when Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, the mountain, of course, becomes the symbol of the temple. And who will go up into the mountain of the Lord? which of course in Psalm 24 is referred to going up onto the Temple Mount, into the temple. It's not just that Moses has given the law and Jesus will now give the law, because Jesus will even say, now the old law is all fulfilled in 35:15. But what he replaces it with, and we've done a whole book out now, I don't know if you've seen it, on 3rd Nephi. And viewing 3rd Nephi as the Holy of Holies within the temple. So it's the holiest part within the Book of Mormon. And when you go into the presence of God, or when God is in your presence, well, that only happens in the Jewish world in the Holy of Holies. So there you have the resurrected Jesus with all of these people, and then you just ask, what were all of the themes or characteristics or qualities of the Holy of Holies? And especially the second half of 3rd Nephi, it picks up all of those.
It certainly works in that.
So, again, it's another connection that I think you're right on, that this is deeply embedded in not just the Moses out of Egypt, but Leviticus, where the temple is established.
There's more in the book that I could tell here, but it's certainly good. Yes, sir.
It's been interesting tonight to hear your perspective on the rabbinical approach to the Book of Mormon, and references the literary approach and the legal approach. As a trained lawyer, Brother Welch, I would expect that you would try to find a precise meaning and be able to articulate it as you might as a judge would do to a statute or an attorney to a client. And Brother Rust, a literary approach, you would find as many levels of meaning as you could in a verse of Scripture. What is the rabbinical approach? Is it a blend of those? Is it somewhere toward one or the other? Do they try to find a precise meaning that God intended in a particular verse, or every possible meaning that might be useful from a verse?
Do I get to answer this? Yes, since I know all things rabbinic, this is a start, and so there's more to it in this book. I think it's a blend. Again, the idea of pashat is paying particularly notice to these words themselves and making sure you know what the words are. But once you have that base, then you're in a position to then extrapolate. There is the idea, certainly, that there are unlimited meanings in many rabbinical writings to the Torah. And you can basically just study one line forever, and you'll get so many meanings out of that. You don't have to keep going. But there is this idea that there's really unlimited meanings. So how does that work? I think it's a little bit of a blend, because you want to make sure that whatever your interpretation is, whatever you're launching off of these things is based on fact and not misreading of those words. Does that sort of help?
Yeah.
We got opinions from other people. Phil.
Well, I think it's even deeper than having an attorney and a literature professor. You've got a dookie and a Tar Heel. And you've got
to the point of absolute evil and absolute good.
Yeah, but you've got a candle that intertwines Blue Devil Blue
that's actually,
with Carolina Blue.
That's true.
And I'm just moved just by the depth of the symbolism and having to rethink my whole relationship with Duke basketball, and it could have been worse. It could have been BYU blue and Butte red.
Yeah. Let me try to unwind this for a second.
No, we'll leave them together.
That's true. That's certainly true. Good insight. Now we have the legal, the literary, and the athletic. Okay. Good question.
I'm in the ancient scripture department here at BYU,
okay.
and I'm not real happy about the curriculum changes.
We're being taped. Can you say that?
I've been very open about that with everyone at the line. I like in your book how you talk about the danger of treating the Book of Mormon as a book of quotes, and I've had students actually tell me that up until they took my class that they just viewed it as a book of quotes. And now I'm worried that now that we're condensing it down to a single semester, I guess, do you have any advice on how to avoid proof texting? I mean, how I turn this into a deep, meaningful class for my students. I'll mention also, all we have at this point is basically the title of the class, Doctrines and Themes of the Book of Mormon. And I'm actually on the committee to design kind of the objectives and the curriculum for that class. And I'm trying to get a variety of...
I have some friends in your department, in your situation. As my understanding, you're working very hard to retain the context, that sort of thing. And I look forward to an implementation that will work that out. I can just say that, I mean, that's crucial to this book, this context. And I think that's crucial to the Rabbiic Approach, that you are reading it as literature, in a sense. I mean, you're certainly concerned about detail, you're concerned about description, you're concerned about personification. And it's, I mean, you can't, and we've done this, we've taken just quotes out of there, but it really guts the meaning of any of these, or so diminishes it. It's really kind of horrible. And I will say for myself, I didn't come, this is one of the reasons I identify with Jews. I grew up in Cincinnati, and at that time, when I was younger, there was one congregation, one ward in Cincinnati. When I was later, teenager years, there were probably 2 or 3. I was the only member, besides my brother, basically, in all of our school system. I come from a part-member family, so I didn't have a lot of the family meetings and that kind of stuff. And I very much felt like there was something about me that nobody really knew, and I didn't have the equipment to explain this sort of thing. And so I didn't have a lot. So when I read some of the Chaim Potok's books, where he talks about Jews in similar positions and how they really wrestled with the scriptures and learned a lot about it and delved deeper, and that was inspiring to me. And so one of my, I never regretted coming to BYU. That was very important to me, taking religion classes, because I needed a scriptural basis. And I, other than a missionary prep class, limited all my classes to scripture classes. And I chose the best professors, like Chauncey Riddle for Book of Mormon, Victor Ludlow for Old Testament, Wilford Griggs for New Testament, and some others. And I cannot tell you how meaningful that was, because it gave me the tools to drill down. And I know you guys will do a good job of preserving that. But there's the danger of simply not giving them the ability to conduct that process, to learn from the scripture, and just giving them the product that will stunt their development forever unless they figure out how to do it. So all I can offer is encouragement and confidence that between you and the people I know, that you will retain that approach and give them the tools that they need. So,
if I could say something in defense of quotes, the problem is not quoting or memorizing. It's not memorizing enough. And if you just pull something out of context, of course, that may open up new meanings that nobody ever thought were there, or eliminate other meanings. But I think the Book of Mormon itself models the importance for the ancient mind of knowing these texts by heart. Most of these people did not have a written copy of the scriptures, but they knew them. Their minds weren't, of course, as cluttered as ours, with lots of other things that they were reading, newspapers and watching television, listening to radio, all kinds of sound that we get into our head. They pretty much had a much smaller canon, and their literary world was pretty well confined. And they also listened to these texts. You talk about how people sat together and read. I think we have to take it on face value that Abinadi, here he is on trial for his life, and he's asked to interpret a passage in Isaiah 52, and what does he do? He quotes the whole chapter 53. He doesn't say, just a minute, let me get my Isaiah scroll out here and read this to you. He knows this by heart. And if you know the scriptures by heart, they go into your heart. And if you know the whole context, and that was the problem with the priests of Noah, they'd taken one little verse out of context, and Abinadi is trying to put it into context. So I recommend memorizing. And a couple experiences from my own life. When I was in the then LTM, I was challenged by the zone leader to memorize the Sermon on the Mount in German. This is Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And I went into his office after I'd done that and passed it off. And I used that almost every day of my mission in Germany. If I wanted to quote something, if I needed, there it was. And I've spent almost 50 years now working on the Sermon on the Mount. And I see things there because I know it by heart. So in my Honors Book of Mormon class, I would only take a few chapters and I'd focus on them. But I made my students, and I had 30 of them, they groused a little bit, but I made them memorize all of King Benjamin's speech and stand up and perform it.
Did you have many students, by the way?
I had students coming back years later saying that was the best experience of my religious education.
Well, tremendously important, but you're talking also about memorizing large swatches. So you're essentially preserving that context.
That's right.
I guess the danger is that something just one or two words. And maybe that's a good beginning when you're young, but the idea of memorizing large...
But you mentioned right in your introduction the importance of quotations in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And, and if you read carefully, I think Jacob knew all of that allegory of the olive tree. He just launches right into it.
Well, I sometimes wonder even about Isaiah's large sections of Isaiah. They
can see themselves in those texts because they have lived with those texts.
But it's a larger sort of thing in context. What he's worried about is just a few words. But
that's the solution.
Right.
It's let's not run away from memorizing. Let's just...
the proof texting is the concern.
Right.
In trying to cover, if our task is to teach the entire Book of Mormon in 26 lectures, it's a struggle.
Yeah. I think this is very rabbinic, though, to memorize.
How about teaching people how to read the Book of Mormon? Maybe that's a better way to go about it, because you don't want people to reach the end of that and say, "No, I know it now," right. Because really what you have been doing is you've launched into a lifetime of interacting with this text, and here's some skills that are going to help you. And you surely do not know it after one semester.
But memorizing large segments can be one way to do that. You've got to give people the tools. Incidentally, this is something that is appealing to my Jewish friends. I remember talking to one fellow, he was actually an economics professor at Duke in one of these, and he said, "Okay, I've been to some other churches. Do Mormons just quote one little scripture out of context in their sermons and that's it?"
No.
We do 3 or 4.
Well, again, if you were to go to a synagogue, there is a parashah, a portion that they would read the entire thing, and then there's a lecture on it explaining the sort of thing. And I'm certain there's some proof texting in the sermon, that sort of thing. But there's this large context of a chapter, 2 chapters, something like that you're reading. And so the idea that we would approach even our memorization as well as our study in a large sort of way and see it in context and see how everything works and see it at multiple levels, I think makes an interesting discussion with that, at least some of my Jewish friends.
And by the way, I think Joseph Smith was interested in those larger contexts. Yeah. In the Relief Society organizational minutes, when he meets with the Relief Society there in Nauvoo, several times it says, and he read, the very first meeting, Joseph read 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And I think he read the whole chapter to get to one particular verse, which is, can the head say to the foot, I have no need of thee, it's all one body. He comes back 2 weeks later and he just doesn't quote charity never faileth, which is what we boil down to as the Relief Society motto. The minutes say he read 1 Corinthians 13, the whole chapter.
Right. And it's such a richer experience with the Book of Mormon. The idea, King Benjamin, only in the service of God. Nice little statement, but if you connect it to who's saying this, King Benjamin, and what has he done, and what is the occasion? This is the coronation of Mosiah, and what Mosiah then does with it, because he basically abdicates the kingdom and switches it. There's so much more going on with that you miss when you just simply quote a few lines.
Your friend Jason wants to ask a question.
I don't notice Jason's hand.
Can I just do a real quick follow-up? Is there like an ideal size for these little, like rabbinic study groups? Let's say I wanted to assign my students that they have to meet in groups of 4 or 5 once a week to read a focused block of scripture. Do you think that?
I don't know about ideal size. You'd have to. Traditionally in the yeshiva, you've got a pair.
Okay.
Just the two of them. And it, again, it's not simply they're just getting together and reading. This becomes a bond sort of thing. The Pathak book, The Chosen, I mean, is really about a havruta, about a pairing. Danny and Reuben are studying together, but they're friends. They're helping each other get to know each other's family. They deal with so many other things. That's really a good example.
So play Matchmakers, BYU.
Yes, in keeping this conversation, I teach Bible Lit in the English department, and so like it's on the front page of my syllabus. Like the prospect of coverage is laughable, right? Like utterly ridiculous. And so
You're on tape, Jason. Come on.
I'm transparent about the fact that this is a class in methods, right? It's about process, and hopefully you have some tools at the end of the semester that you can then and hopefully will apply. And I tried last time assigning Haberto as a kind of approach, kind of backfired. The students, like, it was hard for them to maintain that out of class with conflicting schedules. And they teach it again in the midterm to make that it's either that or journaling, right? One of those two things you have to be doing outside of class as a way of.
Well, just bring up an example about how a partnership got married somewhere along the way.
I don't think that happened.
Oh, okay.
Not that I know of.
Okay. Well, I mean, it is a tough thing, and everything I've read about it. I mean, you are asking difficult questions, and they're probing questions. It's the difference between a shallow friendship and a deep friendship, and it's hard to teach that.
But you can teach habits. I mean, that's it. Habits and the perspective that this is a lifelong study. And here we all are, learning. Here, I learned a lot about the Book of Mormon today, and I've read the Book of Mormon many times in my life. And I learned a lot by connecting it to the Old Testament. It's just very enlightening. And of course, I'm hoping to live another, 40 years, maybe? And I'm going to do the same over and over again. Keep on making more connections, and then living up to what I know. Oh, that's hard.
I think we'll probably wrap up there, but thanks again to all the panelists.